In this PowerPoint, I'll be covering an introduction to Greek verbs. We'll begin by looking at English verbs. Verbs are words that signify actions or states of being. For instance, Barbara hit the ball. Tom was sad. You can tell that Tom was sad is an action happening in the past. So we can tell things about English verbs and we will get into tense in a moment. But English verbs have person, first, second, and third person. First person example would be I am enjoying Greek. So I is your first person English verb. You are too. There's a second person, you. Third person, and these are all singular examples, singular case examples. He is speaking fluently. Third person, he. English verbs can have a number. They can either be singular or plural. For instance, he is doing well is a singular, and again, that is a third person singular is how we would categorize this verb. He is being third person. They are is a third person plural verb. So here we have plural. They are happy. English verbs have tense. So we can have a past tense, a present tense, or a future tense. And in English, these tenses tend to be time-oriented. A present tense example is eat. I eat would be first person singular, I eat. Past tense, I ate. And past participle, eaten. Often we would add I have eaten, or I will eat would also be a future. In English, verbs have voice. They can be either active or passive. In an active tense verb, the subject is doing the action. Jane is hitting. Jane hit the ball, so Jane is actively hitting the ball. Or Jane was hit by the ball is when the subject is receiving the action. So a passive voice. And all of these are going to show up in Greek. So that's why we're covering these English verbs once again. English verbs also have something called mood. Indicative is a mood of reality, what is. Subjunctive is a mood of what could be. I might go to the mall. I might study Hebrew. I might study tonight. Subjunctive is possibility, the realm of possibility, may or may not happen. An imperative mood is a command, go to the mall. An infinitive mood, which is generally a to be verb, to hit, to study, and then the participle. So Jane hit the ball is an indicative example. Jane should have hit the ball, subjunctive. Jane hit the ball is an imperative. To hit the ball was what Jane desired, infinitive. After hitting the ball, Jane ran to first base, an example of a participle, usually an ing verb. After hitting. Now Greek verbs show they show some of these things in a little bit different way, but they're very related to English grammar. So an inflection is when the forms of words change to indicate their function or their meaning in a sentence. Greek verbs indicate their meaning by changing forms. So often there is an affix, an addition of a letter. It could be preceding the word on the front end of the word. It can be in the middle of the word as a suffix, or it can be on the end as an infix, but they're called affixes. It's when the form of the word actually changes to show meaning. And this will make a little more sense here in a moment. Greek verbs have person, like English. The three persons. First is in first person, the person speaking is the subject. Second person, the person being spoken to, is the subject. And third person is the person or thing being spoken about. Greek verbs, like English verbs, have number. They can be either singular or plural. They have tense. In Greek, tense indicates the time, so it could be an action that occurred in the past, in the present, or in the future. Greek verbs have something called aspect, which is the type of action. It could be a continuous action. It could be undefined, as in we don't know for sure what type of action it was. And in Greek, there's also something called a perfective aspect, which is a completed action with ongoing effects. So there's actually a tense called perfect tense. And when Jesus is dying on the cross, he uses a perfect tense verb to telestai, and it says it is finished, is how you often see it translated in an English Bible, but the actual translation would in a literal form would have been it has been finished, or it has been completed. But because it's in the perfect tense, it also is a completed action, but it has ongoing effects in the present. So English will often translate it more to show that present ongoing effect. It is finished. So here's a chart that could be very helpful. You have your tenses on the left-hand side, followed by the time of when that action is representing, and then the aspect. For example, a present tense is tense of reality. Indicative mood would be present tense happening in the present time, and it could be like Jane hitting the ball. The hitting could be continuous, as one way. The future tense happening in the future time can be undefined because we're not sure what it is just yet. Imperfect is a continuous action that happens in the past. So whereas we can have a present action happening continuously in the present, imperfect would be the tense in Greek that would indicate a continuous action in the past. Greek verbs also have a tense called the aorist tense, which indicates a past action. But the interesting thing about the aorist tense is that we are not sure what type of action it is, so it is considered an undefined aspect. Greek also has perfect tense verbs, which I was talking about just a little bit ago, which is a completed action in the past who has effects that are felt in the present. And so often the aspect would be called perfective, could be undefined, could be continuous. We don't know exactly how those actions are felt in the present, so we would look at times we're going to learn about what our options are for translating these Greek verbs, but we're going to have to look around in the context and see if there are any indicators of what type of action is actually taking place. In Greek, there are 6 different tense forms of a verb that you will see if you are looking in BDAG or a lexicon. And those are, you're starting here with agapao. This would be the lexical form of how you're going to see a verb in the dictionary. That is, generally, you will start with your present tense. Now, there are other ways that a verb might show up if it doesn't have a regular present tense. But for right now, let's just do a basic verb example here. So here is agapao. So that first tense is present tense. When you move to the second word, agapeso, this is the future tense form of this verb. The third one over, agapesa, is an aorist tense. Now I can tell, because I know a little more Greek here, there you can see that there are changes happening on the front end. Sometimes in the middle, we had a sigma added here. Sometimes the endings, the infixes are changing. So all of those affixes are showing us a different form of the verb. So again, agapao, the first one was present tense, future tense, agapeso, aorist tense, agapesa, perfect tense, agapeka. This happens to be perfect active when a kappa alpha is added on the end. Agape me is perfect middle passive. And then agapethe or agapethane, it's a nu that drops off at times. This sixth, what we might call principal part or sixth form of the verb is an aorist passive. Now, a way that we know that is theta, eta. That is an indicator on the end, generally indicating aorist passive. Now, if a sigma followed it, that would actually be something else. A future passive, which is why it says aorist passive and future passive. Now, I know this is quite a bit of information to take in all at once, and there are a few more things that you would want to know over time about the forms of the verb. But in general, when you go to a lexicon or a concordance or BDAG, you are going to see verbs displayed in a similar fashion. Now, if a verb does not appear in a certain form, meaning tense, that verb doesn't appear, say, in the future tense, in classical literature or Greek literature or the New Testament, then you would generally see a dash there. But this is a chart that you might want to return to. Interesting thing, so the note here says present for agapao and it's color coded. Then we have future active or middle. What that tells you, and you really would need to know the active and middle endings because they change, and that would indicate it. If you were taking a full Greek course, you would be able to look at the endings and know what that is. For our purposes, we will simply scroll our arrow or cursor over that word using BibleWorks, and we will be able to get the parsing, which tells us all the details about that verb in a particular form all at once. But this future active or middle are built all off of this same root of the word, as is aorist active or middle. So it's not going to be both. It's going to be either active in form or middle, and that again is going to depend on how these infixes change. The fourth principal part, perfect active, is active if it appears in that form, and then that next one following could be either middle or passive, which are actually identical in form, but translated different. And I'll cover that in a minute. And then the last one, aorist passive or future passive, because they happen to be built off of the same principal part. And again, the endings and changes in the beginning and the end, changes in the middle, adding an additional sigma are going to indicate future passive. But all we need to know is kind of what these verbs mean and what you're looking at. But again, parsing, just being able to scroll your cursor over a particular verb in BibleWorks and figure out immediately what you're looking at. Now we just need to know, what do we do with what we're looking at? There's a note here, the imperfect tense, which was the continuous action happening in the past, is built off of the present tense stem, which is this first form of agapao, so the lexicon will often not include it. Greek verbs have voice, which refers to the relationship between the subject and the verb. In particular, there are three types. Active voice, which we saw in the English verb recap. Active voice, the subject does the action of the verb. So the person, the subject, eats. So it's active in voice. A passive voice, like English, the subject receives the action of the verb.